Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Report with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington. Let's get to it. The House will return Tuesday and stay in session through Friday. The Senate is in recess this week and will return next Monday, January 26th. Last week in the House came back on Monday and passed 3 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House passed a rule governing floor consideration of a number of bills. Then the House took up but failed to pass H.R. 2262, the Flexibility for Workers Education Act, by a vote of 209 to 215 when 6 Republicans crossed party lines to vote with Democrats against a bill that was opposed by Big Labor. You heard that right. 6 Republicans voted with Big Labor against a bill that would have incentivized small businesses to offer training and education programs for their employees. After the failed vote, House Republican leaders decided to pull 2 other labor bills from floor consideration. After a series of procedural votes, the House took up and passed H.R. 4593, the Shower Act. On Wednesday, the House took up and passed another rule governing floor consideration of a 2-bill minibus appropriations bill, combining the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill with the National Security and Department of State Appropriations Bill. Then the House took up the bill and began considering amendments to it. After considering and rejecting 2 amendments, the House took up and passed the 2-bill minibus by a vote of 341 to 79. On Thursday, the House took up H.R. 2988, the Protecting Prudent Investment of Retirement Savings Act. After considering 2 amendments, one of which was agreed to, the House passed the amended bill by a vote of 213 to 205. And then they were done. This week in the House will come back today with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House is scheduled to consider 8 bills under suspension of the rules. On Wednesday, and for the balance of the week, the House is scheduled to consider 3 bills pursuant to a rule. They are H.R. 6945, the Supporting Pregnant and Parenting Women and Families Act, H.R. 6359, the Pregnant Students' Rights Act, and H.J. Res. 140, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval of the rules submitted to the Bureau of Land Management relating to Public Land Order Number 7917 for withdrawal of federal lands, Cook, Lake, and St. Louis counties in Minnesota. In addition, it's possible the House may consider H.Con. Res. 68 to direct the removal of United States Armed Forces from Venezuela that have not been authorized by Congress. And I would not be surprised to see another minibus appropriations bill hit the floor. We still have 4 appropriations bills left to pass the House. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Last week in the Senate came back on Monday and voted to end debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 6938, the 3-bill minibus appropriations bill that passed the House the week before. On Tuesday, the Senate tried but rejected an attempt to proceed to S.J. Res. 84, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval of the rules submitted by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services relating to Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, Marketplace Integrity and Affordability. On Wednesday, the Senate was preparing to take the next step in considering the Democrats' War Powers resolution that had passed its first procedural hurdle the prior week. But instead of taking that next step, the Senate considered a point of order, to wit, that there were no ongoing hostilities in Venezuela, and therefore the question of a War Powers resolution was moot. 2 of the 5 Senate Republicans who had crossed party lines to vote with the Democrats on the issue the prior week came back to their GOP colleagues this time, and the vote on the point of order was tied 50 to 50, at which point Vice President J.D. Vance cast the tie-breaking vote to consider the point of order well taken. So the War Powers resolution was killed. On Thursday, the Senate agreed to end debate on H.R. 6938, the 3-bill minibus that had passed the House the prior week. 4 hours later, the Senate passed the bill by an overwhelming vote of 82 to 15, and then they were done. Now to the question, Is there about to be a shakeup at the Department of Labor? Twice over the last 2 weeks, the New York Post has published stories about an Inspector General investigation into the activities of the Secretary of Labor, Lori Chavez DeRemer. The first article, about 10 days ago, reported that the Secretary was under investigation by the Department of Labor's own internal inspector, its Inspector General, for possible fraud, in which she directed her 2 senior aides to schedule personal travel time for her in ways that could be billed to the taxpayers. The first article also reported that the Secretary was also believed to be having an extramarital affair with a subordinate, and that her top 2 aides had been put on administrative leave while the investigation continued. The second article, published in yesterday's edition of the New York Post, reported that the Secretary of Labor maintained a stash of alcohol in her office and regularly drank alcohol during business hours, and that she had taken staff members to a strip club on one trip. We'll see where this goes. Now to more on government funding. The House has now passed 8 of the 12 appropriations bills needed to fund the government on an annual basis, while the Senate has passed 6 of the 12. Government funding for the agencies that still have to be funded runs out at the end of next week. And 2 of the remaining bills, the Defense Department Appropriations Bill and the Labor, Health and Human Services Appropriations Bill, are the 2 biggest annual spending bills, and they are almost always the toughest to negotiate to passage. But they've got to be passed, and the House may find a way to put together a minibus package and put it on the floor this week, so the Senate could take it up next week when it returns from its recess. Stay tuned on this. Now to health care. The further we get away from the December 31 deadline for the expiration of the Obamacare advance premium tax credits, the longer become the odds for a bipartisan agreement to extend them in some form or fashion. And the fact that the Senate is not even in session this week means that the odds of coming to some kind of bipartisan agreement in the Senate are even longer. It's not just the subsidies that are at issue. Excuse me. Republicans and Democrats are also at odds over Hyde Amendment language, where Hyde Amendment refers to the long-standing prohibition in U.S. law against taxpayer funding of abortion and abortion services. 2 weeks ago, President Trump, thinking he was nudging congressional Republicans to make a deal with Democrats to remove a political liability from the GOP side of the ledger, told congressional dealmakers that the GOP should be, in his words, flexible. If that was his plan, it backfired. Pro-life groups, one of the mainstays of the Republican voter turnout operation every other year, were outraged and said so. Speaker Mike Johnson, himself a committed pro-lifer, said so too. The end result is that we're 2 weeks further away from that inflection point, and we're no closer to a deal on extending the subsidies for 2 years, let alone 3. Now to Iran. According to widespread media reports, President Trump came very close in the middle of the week last week to ordering military strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran in support of the protests that have sprung up around the country over the last several weeks. He had warned the Iranian mullahs that killing their own people would be a red line for him. He threatened that if the regime were to begin executing its own people, he would take action. And given that the last time he took military action against Iran, he had a bunch of B-2 stealth bombers fly 37 hours round trip so they could drop bunker buster bombs on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities, his threat had credibility behind it. Many U.S. allies urged President Trump not to engage Iran militarily. The Saudis and the Israelis in particular urged him to bide his time. European allies, too, urged the same thing. So did Vice President Vance, according to several media reports. The president chose not to order the military strikes last week. According to the media reports, it was because he was informed that his commanders could not guarantee him that U.S. military strikes would lead to the downfall of the regime. But that was a week ago, and now there are new U.S. military assets assembling in the region. Last week, for instance, he didn't have an aircraft carrier battle group in the Mediterranean to provide air cover in case of an Iranian retaliatory strike. In a few more days, he will. So, just because the Iranian mullahs survived last week doesn't mean they're necessarily out of the woods, at least not all the way, not yet. Keep your eyes on this one. Now to Greenland. Okay, President Trump's desire to acquire Greenland is a serious thing, a very serious thing, and we're going to be talking about it more and more in coming weeks and months. For starters, all you have to do is look at a polar map of the Earth, that is, looking down from a bird's eye view of the North Pole, and you can see how Greenland is A, in the Western Hemisphere, and B, a critical strategic choke point for sea lanes between Russia, China, and the North Atlantic. With melting ice caps opening up sea lanes that weren't open 20 years ago, Greenland becomes increasingly vital to the defense of the Western Hemisphere. So the president's determination to acquire the territory makes sense from a strategic perspective. On Saturday, President Trump declared that 8 European countries that oppose his move to acquire Greenland would have a new 10% tariff imposed on their exports to the United States beginning February 1. Those tariffs would rise to 25% on June 1 and would stay in place until such time as Greenland had been acquired by the United States. The Europeans have not yet reacted. I imagine they are waiting to see and hear more from the president, who is in Davos for the annual meeting of the financial elites at the World Economic Forum. He's scheduled to deliver remarks there tomorrow, and everyone is waiting with bated breath. Stay tuned. And that's our Washington Report for this week. If you've got any questions or comments, please drop us a line at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. If you want me to answer a question during the broadcast, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Washington Report. Same time, same channel. Until then, be well and be active.